hopefully get started. Perfect. So yes, I am going to be talking today about personal religion, and all about individual beliefs and rituals. Um, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about me. I'm just going to make you all a bit smaller. There we go. Now I can see my own screen. So as Irene so kindly said, I am the Departmental Lecturer in Ancient History at the University of Oxford. I did my PhD at the University of Exeter in the UK, and I love teaching and studying the ancient world because it's fascinating. I think, gosh, the ancient world is so weird in some ways. The ancient Greeks are so weird, and I think the more you get to know them, the more weird they seem sometimes. But I love the opportunity to, particularly with students, start questioning beliefs about others and the way that we can come across as like othering people. And how can we find ways of sort of connecting with their experience? And I think that's particularly why I'm drawn to ancient religion. It's such a personal experience. Well, religion in general is such a personal thing. And when you're dealing with different sets of beliefs, it's just fascinating to me. And maybe I'm just inherently nosy. And so when I deal with the ancient world, particularly in my area of research, I'm like, oh, go on, tell me about this person that slighted you. Why do you want to curse them? And and I'm hoping that today we're going to be able to do a bit of this. We're going to think about different personal motivations for different actions and how we can start to think about how we understand these actions. How can we get inside the thought process of these ancient people when they're so far removed from us and our lived reality? So my research, just to give you a little bit of a background, because you'll see it coming through all the way through this talk, I did my PhD entitled The Conceptions of the Dead and the Divine in Curse Tablets. I've got publications on Roman curse tablets and curse tablets from Carthage, because we've got two written in Punic script. One of them is published. And so this is something that's being made a long time before the Romans resettle or found their colony at Carthage. But is this practice continuing? Is it reintroduced? Things like that. I've got a book coming out based on my PhD, and I'm currently working on late antique curses. So normally from places like Egypt and the Levant. But what's particularly interesting about those curses and that region is that we've got the curses. So someone writing a curse tablet against an enemy, or someone they would like to be loved by, but who doesn't love them back. Classic unrequited love comes up quite often. But we've also got spells and amulets and things like that, where people are trying to protect themselves from being cursed or react against the fact that they might have been cursed. And I think that's just so interesting. How do we think about living in a world where there is this threat against you, a threat against your personhood? It's not necessarily a physical act of violence that you could try to defend yourself against. It's something much more remote. And what would that mean for living in that world? Do you understand different groups as being more likely to be accursed? Or do you understand those situations that you should try and avoid and things like that? So that's kind of where I am at the moment. And I think I warn you that this has quite heavily influenced what I want to talk about with you today. This idea of both cursor and victim, and how that's sort of an interaction in the ancient world. So I just want to start with a little bit of like why I think the studying of ancient religion in particular is so important. And this is a quote from Julia Kind's 2012 book, Rethinking Greek Religion. And she talks about how Greek religion was regarded as a sort of marginal topic and kind of removed from the hard surfaces of Greek life, politics, and society. There's quite a lot of older scholarship that propagated the image of ancient Greek religion as being more concerned with fertility rites. And I think that's really interesting, because often if we don't understand something and there's women involved, we pin it as a fertility rite. You know, the Eleusinian Mysteries, how many times have it been described as fertility rites? And we don't actually have any idea, but, you know, women, therefore this. And I think that says quite a lot about ourselves and our what we would expect rituals to be like for these different groups of people. But I just think I love this quote because it emphasizes the fact that we are approaching ancient religion in a slightly different way. And I'm going to introduce some of the different approaches that we're taking to you in this talk, because we've got some very modern, very changeable views. And I just would like to think about kind of why they're useful and interesting. So, as I sort of say, you know, focusing on the individual is my thing. As I say, probably because I'm quite nosy, and I used to work in retail and I used to love chatting to people, you know, tell me why you want a yellow coat, and let's not buy a yellow coat because it's going to look as hideous on you as it does on me. You know, you've got to be blessed to wear yellow, and sadly, I'm not. But I think the focus on the individual is really interesting when we think about the ancient world, because we're used to this kind of idea of great men, and we kind of focus on Roman emperors or particular ancient Greek statesmen. But how much are they constructed by the historiography is very important to consider. But what about sort of, dare I say, ordinary individuals who are living and surviving in the ancient world? And I think what can be really useful about considering the aspects of these particular individual lives is that it can make classics and ancient history much more interesting and accessible for, well, everybody. I was going to say young people because they're the people I work with, but for everybody, if we think about why would someone respond in that way to an event or a monument or a ritual or a speech or a play? Why would they respond like that? Why would someone I don't know do that? Why would I do that? And we start to think about these different groups and how different people can respond to the same thing. And I think that's any kind of critical engagement with other people's experiences and the development of a kind of empathy. I think that's so important in the modern world, particularly, you know, given that we are so quick as human beings to make assumptions about things. So this is kind of why I really emphasize a focus on the individual in my lectures and things like that. And I hope by the end of this, you'll start to see the merit in this. So there are so many different approaches and theories that you can apply to the ancient world and to ancient religion. And I am going to introduce you to all kinds. I'm going to talk about different case studies and think about them through these different approaches. And then hopefully by the end, you'll have an idea of what you think is helpful or unhelpful, what's interesting, do some of them work together? And I'm hoping you can take it out into the world and share it with people, because sometimes these new approaches get entangled in the web of scholarship. And I just would love to get them out there to be critically engaged with. Some of them you may think, oh my goodness, Charlotte, like really, this is just too abstract, or it doesn't give me a way to the answers that I'm looking for. And that's, you know, totally fine. I just would love for them to be thought about. But all of these kind of center on the individual, and I'm hoping through these examples, as I say, these case studies will decide for ourselves what's interesting and what's not. So I'm going to start with some of the very modern approaches. So these are embodied and cognitive approaches to ancient religion. And some of you may have been lucky enough to attend Ben Cassell's talk, and it's available as a recording. He is really good. He's working on his PhD at King's College in London, and he's very good at thinking about this kind of embodied and cognitive approach. But I think these are perhaps something we do quite naturally when we're dealing with individuals in the ancient world. So an embodied approach considers the sensory and physical elements of a ritual. And that could be physicality, you're walking on hot marble or a dusty road and the dust is coming up and clouding around you. Or it could be you're carrying something heavy in an awkward way. What does that mean for the physical sensation in your body? Or you're standing around in the agora for hours. What does that mean? Your lower back aches, your feet ache, your calves start to cramp up. And if we think also about traveling in the ancient world, be that for a religious festival, for jury duty, things like that, how long is it going to take you to get there and through what means? Are you going to have to walk for hours and hours and then be expected to engage as a citizen in something quite complicated? Or are you going to take a kind of slightly bumpy cart and then that's a different kind of juddering and jarring experience? And then you've got cognitive. And I love this way that Robert Parker describes it. So it's an attempt to show how minds are capable of harboring religious conceptions, doesn't have to be religious, and in particular, those conceptions are not products of a special religious sensibility, but ordinary cognitive process. So basically, a cognitive approach. Ancient brains are not that different to ours. The memory sections of the brain are slightly more developed because they're not jotting everything down to remember them. And there is a different importance placed on memorization. And if we think about the Homeric epics and Herodotus and things like that. But ultimately, what in our brains makes us react to certain things? What induces fear in us? If we hear about certain rituals where young women are chased, even if you're playing a game with your friends and you're being chased, you get that elevated heart rate, you get the adrenaline, and it's quite, I was going to say it's quite all-encompassing, but I think there's also a sharpness to it, but you're very invested in it, even if you know that you're just playing. And I think even if you're partaking in a ritual where there is this element, you know, it's just part of the ritual, you're not actually in any danger, but still the body has these kind of inbuilt reactions to things. And I think that's why I've put these two together. An inbuilt reaction is kind of embodied, but it's also kind of cognitive. How are our brains working? What would bring us joy? What would bring us fear? What does walking into a dark place and then being surrounded by the sound of other worshippers do? You know, there's been lots of studies with the Pythian Apollo to try and figure out if there were vapors and things like that. But still, you know, think about entering into the temple from the bright light, or after your religious experience, walking out again and being sort of shocked by that sunlight. You know, we all have that moment when we walk out of a dark building into the light. Things like that, I think sometimes we miss because we forget about the actual people undertaking various things. So these are some very interesting and useful pieces of work that I thought I would put in here. You can revisit them in the recording, or I'm happy, Irina's got a copy of the slides, so she's happy to share some of these with you. And they're about these approaches. So a couple are shorter length journals, and then there's an edited volume which has got some interesting chapters. But they're really helpful for thinking about literally down to the feeling of the clothes on the skin, what kind of clothes and who is wearing them, how heavy are they, how hot would it be to wear these kind of things and be expected to process in a very accurate way. So yeah, these are kind of little recommendations of mine as ways into this for the study of it. So I would like us to think about a particular experience. So we're going to just start with a bit of Thucydides. This is not the direction I thought this talk was going to take, but as I was thinking this through, so we're starting with the funeral oration from Thucydides book 2. And so we're talking about a public funeral for those who had first fallen in this war. So it was the custom of the ancestors, and the manner of it as follows. So 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead were laid out in a tent which had been erected, and their friends bring to their relatives such offerings as they please. Then you have a funeral procession with cypress coffins, one for each tribe. So you've got mixed remains in each of these coffins. And then you get an empty one, decked for those whose bodies could not be recovered. And I think we're all quite used to this section of Thucydides. If you're not, it's actually very, very powerful. The Greek is tricky, and I think sometimes that means we lose the kind of power of the words. But anyone can join in with this procession, and the female relatives are there to wail. So you've got this oratory element to it. Then you have this big public tomb in a beautiful suburb of the city for the dead. There is this exception, those slain at Marathon, because they have their own special tomb set up at Marathon. And then we end up with an appropriate panegyric being recited, and then everybody leaves. What I think is really interesting about this is, you know, if you're being taught this at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and the section's just read to you, and you're like, oh, good Lord, I am tired, and what is going on here? The language can be quite tricky. Sometimes classics can be accused of being a bit dry. But this particular passage, I think, if we approach it from this like embodied or cognitive or individual focused approach, becomes extremely powerful. So we're talking about quite a hot period of the year in Greece. We've got the bones, but it's not just the bones. It's sort of whatever remains of these people laid in a tent in the heat. So you have to go into this stuffy, gloomy tent. The smell would be quite something. The visceral experience of just seeing the amount of loss would be quite something. Then you've got this empty, see, I feel emotional thinking about it, but this empty coffin for those that are missing. I think that's such a powerful moment. You know, there you've got 10 coffins for the 10 tribes filled with mixes of remains. I mean, to be confronted with that much loss, and then to be reminded that there's a more loss that you can't calculate because you don't have the data. And then you've got the noise, you've got the women wailing for their loss, you've got the idea of processing behind that. I think it's all extremely powerful. But what I really like about approaching this from an individual level is that we can start to think about parallels in our world. So this is a war memorial from my home city in Plymouth in the UK. It's massive, and the Hoe is a huge area right on the seafront. So in front of this memorial is the ocean. There's a famous lighthouse called Smeaton's Tower, which is cheery and red and white and very jolly. And behind it is this huge, huge monument with lists and lists of names. And we know that the names of the dead were listed on monuments in ancient Athens. When I talk about this with my students, I say to them how many have actually stopped and read the names in the war memorials in their towns and their cities. And most of them couldn't tell you what any of the names were on there. They don't sit and read them. They don't interact with them in that way. But they know what they are, and they know what they stand for and what loss they illustrate. Plymouth is slightly different because it's a military city, and so there are big festivals and people come explicitly to see the names of their relatives there. There's another one that I thought might be particularly interested for my American friends. This is just down the road from where I live now. This is Slapton Sands in Devon. And this is a memorial for the US Army because of their cooperation in Exercise Tiger or Operation Tiger, the D-Day rehearsals. But 740 men lost their lives in these exercises. And this Sherman tank was actually sunk during the attack, and it was rescued and placed as a memorial. Now, what's really interesting here is there are no names on the tank, but the tank is more popular as a thing to visit than the kind of obelisk a bit further along the road. But these things are part of our kind of cultural landscape, and we walk past them and we understand them. But what kind of individual response do we have? It varies from individual to individual, and that's kind of my point here. If we think about the embodied responses to these monuments, we can either walk past them and acknowledge them and just see them as part of our cultural history, or we can walk up to them, we can touch them, it's a physical reminder. And sometimes it's just the volume of names on these things that can be really overwhelming without having to actually go and read them. Because often we run into issues of literacy in the ancient world. Who could read what? Were people actually standing there and reading these things? And I would say to you, does it matter? Is it not just being able to recognize that there is writing on it and know what it is? What does that do to you cognitively? And I think particularly as we start to think about how the ancient world changes over time, how do different generations interact with these, but how is cultural memory kept alive? How is the ritual of visiting these sites kept alive? So we're going to talk about religion proper now. We're going to talk about something a bit more cheery. I would like to talk to you about polis religion start, polis or civic religion. And this is kind of the, dare I say, traditional way of approaching ancient religion. So we've got this idea of religion and state being very closely linked. And this is something that people from all around the world approach in very different ways. In the UK, there's meant to be this division between religion and state. But then our monarch is the head of state and also meant to be God's representative on earth. So they're very much enmeshed. in our kind of daily lives. And also, even for those that aren't practicing Christians in the UK, many of our legal codes and our like moral understandings are still entwined with the idea of like Christian morality. So polis religion is very much focused on this. It arises in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the parish school, as a way of approaching religion. You know, we've got festivals organized by the polis, they're about polis identity. How can individuals engage with this religious festival without engaging with the idea of the polis? And again, thinking back to the like cultural landscape of the polis, if you think about the Panathenaic Way in Athens, it's a physical thing. The city has to maneuver around it when it's not festival time. But it's also something you can walk up outside of the festival time. Does it still have those connotations for you? Are you remembering your niece being a basket carrier? Are you remembering yourself take part in the festival? Are you remembering how it's absolutely freezing, it's winter, you're trudging up there, and yet you remember how burning hot it can be for some of the festivals? And what does that mean for your interactions with this space? And how do they change? And now there's the idea of personal religion, and I absolutely love this way of thinking about this. We have this wonderful edited volume coming out by Julia Kint, which is all about Greek personal religion and has different chapters. But these ideas started for her in the aforementioned 2012 monograph. And she thinks about it as individual engagement with the supernatural about private concerns. And this is kind of why I love this, because it's a way out of this dichotomy between magic and religion. What is considered appropriate religious practice? What isn't, and is therefore considered to be magical? And I think this is very helpful because we have our own ideas of appropriate religious practice. And these can vary across different Christian denominations, across different religions. And we have kind of some orthodoxy. We have some kind of laying out of what is appropriate and inappropriate. Whereas ancient Greek religion, we can kind of approach a bit more through orthopraxy. So it's the actions that kind of make up the sense of what is appropriate. And so we have elements of ancient religion, particularly like I work on curse tablets, that have been viewed as being magical. They invoke the wrong powers. They invoke chthonic powers rather than Olympian deities. We now know, apologies, that this isn't actually true. We have different powers invoked in different places at different times. Sometimes the dead are invoked, but they are very much about personal concerns, and some of them are, please bind the tongue of the person who's going to speak against me in this legal case. I mean, I don't think that's particularly sinister. I think, you know, everybody was probably cursing each other in the hope that they would win the legal case. Others are more sinister, you know, they call for like pretty painful demise of people. And I think, but I think you can't divide curse tablets too much into different, like, is this religious, is this magical? Because they're engaging with their wider learned social and religious contexts. Curse tablets have no elements of reciprocity in them. And so you've got to be building this relationship with the gods or the dead that you're invoking some other way. And you are through other religious practices. And I think this links back to what I was saying about this individual approach. You have different gods and different epithets for different gods, or gods in different guises, and they will have different resonances for different people. Do you engage more closely with gods like Ares because you have a hoplite father, husband, son? Or is it Artemis because you are having to undergo childbirth or have successfully undergone childbirth and things like that? And I think it's perfectly understandable for all of us if we think about these as changing throughout our lives, these different relationships. But they are also informed by what other people around us are doing. You're not going to have a particular temple on your island and not venerate that goddess. And I also think, if we think about cultural memory and the cultural landscapes, if you have monuments set up in thanks to successful outcomes, particularly if you think about some of the thank offerings dedicated on the Acropolis. Some of them are very large. And if you're trying to access that religious space, you can see the physical manifestation of the power of the gods and the goddesses in these thank offerings. But then again, it's how you engage with them. Have you had a lucky encounter with the gods and goddesses, or do you feel slighted by them? And that affects how you interact with this space. So these are kind of the different approaches that I want us to think about. And there are two more that I'm going to briefly introduce before we look at some case studies. So we've got the lived religion approach, and I love this approach, and it really underpins quite a lot of what I do. So it's about using scattered evidence like curse tablets, whatever, and making sure that we keep a focus on the individual people enacting these rituals and things. So rather than having like a generic overview of, oh, this is a ritual and it's the same across the ancient world, which I think we would all think is pretty risky if we think about ancient oracles. You know, different oracles require different actions. Some you descend under the earth, some you go and ask a question to, some it's by lot, some you write your question on lead curse tablets and you're in a leafy grove. So they're very different experiences for individuals. And then the powers you're addressing would also make that a very different experience. So this is kind of the focus of the lived religion approach. And then we have vernacular religion theory, which is similar, but it's all about religion as a lived experience for ancient individuals. So as I was talking about earlier, individuals making decisions based on their social realities and pressures. But it's about this doctrine isn't coming into it. You know, there is very much an active participation of the ritual, and the decision to undertake the ritual in the first place is very important. So I think that the best way to approach ancient religion is to kind of mesh these together and approach different scenarios through them to figure out what we can glean. And it's just about, well, from my perspective, it's just about looking at something from different angles. Sometimes you might end up looking at the back of something, you think, I've learned nothing here. And other times you're like, oh, actually, this angle means that I see this in a slightly different way, and it's actually very illuminating. But I think combining particularly personal and polished religion as two different approaches to the ancient world means that you prioritize personal decision making whilst also recognizing that polished religion has an impact. Because as we've seen on the previous slide, there's the idea of social pressures. If you belong to a particular community, you engage with that community and you follow a kind of set of rules. You understand the terms of engagement with each other within that community. You understand the most appropriate way of greeting people. You understand who the main gods and goddesses are. And I also think the polis of religion is really interesting because the polis has to set up and give over the space for these religious practices, and the polis develops around them. Which important religious centres don't get moved or built over? Which dominate the skyline? Which would people see as they approach the polis? What would be the first thing you see if you approached Athens through the Attic hinterland? The Acropolis. What's shining on the Acropolis? What's in this beautiful marble in the sunlight? Again, that's a kind of embodied approach to it. And why would you engage with these big community-based religious centres rather than worshipping in your home? What about shrines in the home? The Adonai festival in Athens, where women worshipped on the roofs of their homes. And I absolutely love the fact that I think it's Thucydides and Plutarch talk about they're having a meeting about the Sicilian expedition in the assembly. And one of the generals is grumbling about the fact that he can hear the women undertaking this festival, and they're singing and they're laughing and they're cheering, and it's all, you know, this cacophony of noise across Athens and different rooftops. And there's this very serious historical moment going on in the middle of it. So is that polis religion because everybody in the polis is doing the same thing at the same time? Well, it's actually mostly women. So then is it polis religion? But if there's civic things going on at the same time, which have had their own religious elements, you know, you can't have a meeting without first following the appropriate rituals. Is it personal religion that's interfering with the polished religion, or is it multi-layered? And I just think these are questions that I love, and you can tell that I'm like an academic nerd because this is fun to me, and I just love trying to figure all this out. And I also would like to think about kind of personal innovation with religious practices. Not every votive offering looks the same. Not every votive offering has the same formula of words inscribed on it. In my curse tablets, they're very varied, but then they also use certain phrases. And so, how do we understand that information is being shared? Is it shared in written handbooks? Is it shared orally? Is it a case of you ask your friend, your neighbor, or you've heard about it generally, or you've seen someone else do it, or there's a priest you can ask? And so I think we can think about different types of religious networks and how they overlay each other, how they might cross each other, things like that. So let's have a look at my case study of votive offerings and how we can think about these with these different approaches. So this is a bronze shield. It's in the Agora Museum in Athens. And I really hope you can see in the picture these kind of punched letters. And you can just kind of make out a kappa and a delta and things like that. It's a little bit tricky to see because obviously it's behind glass, but this is a proper full-size bronze shield, so it's huge and heavy. It's from the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC. And on it, it says the Athenians from the Lacedaemonians at Pylos. So the Athenians managed to seize this and have dedicated it as an offering. And what I love about this is to think about, if I think about this as an embodied thing, a shield is a heavy thing. If you've already got one of your own, it's nearly impossible to carry two. But there has been the attempt, well, it's not even an attempt, they've successfully done it, to take this heavy shield back to Athens in order to dedicate it. And then you have the ritual element of piercing each of these dots to make these letters. And they're big letters. You want it to be really clear who has taken this from whom, and therefore have that kind of as part of this aggrandizement. So it's an offering to the gods. And it's common. We find lots of offerings of shields, helmets, all that kind of stuff throughout the ancient world at different sanctuaries and temples. But I just love to think about how this got there. What was the decision making behind it? What was the physical effort? What would it have looked like when it was kind of not oxidized and was bronze and shiny? It would be gleaming in the sunlight. It would be a real moment. And I would say that, you know, this is definitely polished religion. It's the Athenians from the Lacedaemonians. So it's not an individual names, like on the helmet from Olympia, it says like Miltiades down the side of it. So it's very much given and interacting with this idea of polished religion. And at the same time, people are going to see and interact with it. And they're going to understand this as a manifestation of the power of the polis and the fact that their polis is blessed by this particular deity. But also it's the people behind the dedication that I think it's really interesting to think about. These are my favourite warlike votive offerings. So this one in the middle, the helmet, fits on the end of my finger. So it's like thimble sized. And it's a tiny helmet. You can see for scale what it's like in the case. And then you've got mini shields. These are all from Olympia. And there's loads of them, loads and loads of them. So these are not objects that have been sort of seized as spoils of war. They have been made especially for dedication. And I love that idea. If we think about this from a personal religion perspective, you've been successful in battle. You are unable to lug two giant bronze shields back. Completely reasonable. You're exhausted. You're probably still in a bit of a frenzy, probably a bit traumatized by the whole thing. But you make the effort to have something made or seek out something that has been made in order to dedicate it to the gods. Lots of these aren't inscribed. And sometimes there's the argument, oh, well, then they're less educated, they couldn't inscribe them. I mean, good luck to you inscribing something in Greek on a tiny, tiny helmet. But I also think, if we think, I've just talked about this huge bronze shield, it gleams in the light, it's big, it's got big letters, everyone can see what's going on there. This tiny, tiny helmet, I mean, it's not a focal point, unless it's in a museum on a plinth, beautifully lit so that someone like me walks in and goes, oh my gosh, a tiny helmet, how amazing. But it's about that personal engagement with the divine powers, isn't it? It's about wanting to express something from yourself to the divine power, rather than being able to go, hey, look at me expressing myself to this divine power. It's much more personal. And I think if you think about walking to the Temple of Olympia, past all these other huge monuments and things like that, with something like this in your hand, with your in your pocket, something this small you could carry over a much longer distance, and so you've got this personal relationship with you. By the time you dedicate it, it's probably warm from your touch. It's very interesting to think about that as a kind of giving over something. You're giving over the warmth of your body through this. But also there must have been the knowledge that these sites get rammed full of offerings, and so they do get cleared. So there's an understanding that something like this isn't going to last forever. So there's a kind of sharing of a moment. The moment of the giving over of the offering, I think, becomes much more important than if you give over, say, a huge statue of yourself, because that's going to be lasting there for much longer. And it's going to have repeated moments of acknowledgement because other people are going to see it, see who's dedicated it, and think about that relationship. Whereas something small like this, there's not going to be that repeated engagement with it. So the concept of reciprocity I've mentioned so much, and I say here it's fundamental to the dedication of votive offerings. It absolutely is, but it's also fundamental to ancient religion, the ancient way of life. If we think about the concept of exania, we think about episodes from the Homeric epics. You know, warriors literally don't kill each other over these like family ties. This is all built on the same idea of like gift giving and reciprocity. And I kind of didn't spell this out because I talked about it earlier, but these sanctuary sites are community sites, they are polis religion sites, but you are enacting a point of personal religion within these sites. And there's the personal decision making. Because in this, I didn't say in this slide, but these are mini shields as well. So you could have a mini helmet, you could have a mini shield. There might have been mini spears. What do you choose to dedicate and why? I think is really, really interesting. And this example is one of my favorite examples of the ancient world. So this is from the Athenian Acropolis. It's an early 4th century BC statue base. And it's just wonderful. So there's a really important maxim I haven't got now today, which is unusual for me. The dead don't bury themselves. The dead don't commemorate themselves. You know, this is something that we've not got the Egyptian pharaohs, you know, building their tombs for 30 years before they die here. And even then, you know, they have to be placed in them by their descendants or by their trusted advisors. And quite often they get reused by other people. So the dead can express their wishes, but other people have to carry them out. So again, we've got this kind of community coming together to see this through. But this statue, the statue on it is missing, but the statue base emphasizes that we've got Lysimachie. She was a priest of Athena Polyast for 64 years. So she was 88 when she died, which is amazing for the ancient world. She saw 4 generations of children, and it was dedicated by her daughters, which I think is just phenomenal. So we've got this female interaction with a place that's obviously incredibly important, because this woman has dedicated most of her life to being a priestess of Athena Polyas. So to give recognition of that in the form of this statue base, I think is wonderful. But I also think, and this is what I was saying about historiography and our own approaches shaping our interpretations of the ancient world, your image is a part of you. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten in the ancient world. We share photos and memories with people so freely, but you are giving away a part of you in these images. You're like, oh, look at my wonderful holiday. I want you to have part of that experience. So we've got this physical embodiment of this woman being placed somewhere that was obviously extremely important to her in her life. And the importance of this space to her, and the importance of her role to the polis more broadly, is being broadcast, and people are going to see her. There's going to be oral traditions about her. She may become a kind of signpost around the Acropolis. Oh, well, you go left at this particular statue to get to this particular space. You know, it's not always got these overt religious connotations. What's also really interesting is that there's this theory that the Lysistrata and Lysistra of the play is based on this priestess, which I think is so cool. So cool. But I just would like us to think about how it would feel to visit this statue as well if you'd known this woman in life. You know, you would see the statue. Is it a fair representation of her? Is it an idealized representation of her? Does it make you happy to think of her in this place? Do you conceive of her as being in this place forevermore and has to become literally part of the fabric of this religious landscape? Does it make you feel like because she's on the Acropolis looking out over the polis, that she's looking over you and there's still that link? Does it make you very sad? You know, you're being reminded of someone you've lost. Does it make you laugh that her daughters have set up this statue when actually it's a terrible rendition of her? Her hair was never like that, and she'd have been horrified that her peplos was styled in that way. You know, these are all things that are lost to us. But if we think about how human beings approach these things, I think we can start to really engage on a much deeper level with some of these ideas, and some of these ideas as religious practice, putting the practice in the practice of ancient religion. So yes, this is one of my favorite examples, and as you can tell, I feel very attached to this particular statue base, and I hope it's kind of started to gather, well, to tie. Well, I was going to say gather together, but hopefully to tie together some of these threads and things that we've talked about today. And that is the end of my slideshow. So I think we've got time for a few questions.
I muted myself as well. Thank you so much, Charlotte, as always, for giving us so much to think about. I'm going to stop the recording now so we can just have a discussion without just on anything these bring to mind. So 1 second.